Hello and welcome everyone. Hope you're having a good time here at Kanji this year. My name is Dan, the Video Ninja. Y'all know who I am. I've been around for a while and you've seen me pop up here and there so far this weekend. And I'm here for the next hour or so to talk to you about video games. I appreciate everybody getting hype and everything in the chat or whatever. I've got the chat up here. Make sure that you keep that up, keep that energy going. We want to keep it lively and exciting and throw all the emotes and exclamation marks and punctuation and all that fun stuff out there as much as you possibly can. This is my 4th year in a row bringing you all some stories and info about games for Kanji. In the past years or so, I've used this opportunity to speak mostly about more indie type games that may remind you all of some of the games that we used to remember from years and even decades ago. Well, this year is no different because I've got a new list to dive into. Some of the games on this list are newer, possibly more obscure games, but they all have a few things in common with some of the classics from back in the day that I'm sure most of you will recognize. Christina, loves your voice. Thank you. I don't have my voice changer on, do I? Nick was telling me that I had my voice changer on during the opening ceremonies, and yeah, that was embarrassing. But anyway. So, back to the games. Some of these indie titles you may have heard of, but I'm sure there's at least one fresh entry in this list for everyone here. This should be a lot of fun. Don't forget, as I was just saying, and as you guys have obviously heard me and are responding, pop off in the chat with all the emotes about titles that you recognize, whether it's the old games we're going to be talking about or the newer games that you haven't heard of or whatever. As a streamer, you know, as streamers, we love to see the chat just going crazy with excitement and seeing the list of all the stuff that you guys are trying to punch in there, pop and fly by. It's fun, good stuff. I'm going to try to keep things at a bit of a brisk pace here, but I'm probably going to stop in between games or so just for, you know, hydration and everything, since that's important. Also to catch my breath or whatever, because I get kind of caught up in this kind of stuff. Plus, an opportunity to check in with you guys, make sure that you're still with me, and see if maybe you got comments or questions that maybe we can touch on a little bit here and there. I don't know that we'll be able to, you know, do any like deep dive tangents in between the games because, like I said, we've got a lot to get through here. So maybe if we have time at the very end, if I manage to finish up a little earlier and I can chew on one or two of the questions or so, and we can go off on a little bit of a tangent, then we'll see. Like last year, we'll kick off each of the 10 entries that we're going to be talking about tonight with a reveal and a recap of a classic game. In some cases, classic in this case just meaning really old. But they all share similarities with some of the indie games that I have to present with you. Just bear with me, you know, some of us, it benefits a lot of us seasoned gamers who sometimes find it a little bit of a challenge to find the time or even the spoons to give newer, smaller indie games a chance, unless they remind us of something that we remember just loving the hell out of when we were kids, you know? So, that cool with everybody? We good to go? Cool. So first, some housekeeping though. You're going to see some game footage on the screen here as I go through my presentation. Some of it might be a little flashy. Some of it might be a little fast moving or so. If you've got issues with that or whatever, just do what you can to take care of yourself. We don't want anybody feeling uncomfortable or whatever, so if you've got any kind of photosensitivity issues or whatever like that, just take care of yourself. We all understand. Also, one or two of the entries that I have on the list here might be a little bit pushing the boundaries of our PG-13 mandate. Nothing too graphic, I promise, but viewer discretion is advised, okay? So, first, before we get to the actual list proper, though, I have a lot of and another things at the beginning of this for some reason. I don't know. That's just how the script shook out this year. To get it out of the way, though, before we get into the list proper, we have an honorable mention, which is I'm going to just put out here at the beginning because I just wanted to touch on it lightly. We're not going to go into it in depth because it is a comparison that was made pretty much all of last year leading up to the release of this indie game that everybody has probably heard all of, and the discussion has basically been made, so we're not going to dive too much into it. So we're just going to touch on it so that nobody can come up to me afterwards after the panel and say, why didn't you talk about this? So honorable mention goes to all the discussions and comparisons that were made last year between Chrono Trigger and Sea of Stars. everybody heard the discussion. It was like everybody was saying that Sea of Stars was the spiritual successor to all of the Super Nintendo RPGs of the 90s or so, and Chrono Trigger here could be substituted pretty much with any of the Super Nintendo RPGs. Final Fantasy IV, Final Fantasy VI, Super Mario RPG certainly, and so on. So yes, we're just mentioning it here. We're not going to dive too much into it. Everybody at this point, I assume, has seen gameplay footage of it or played it themselves. They've all been through Sea of Stars. It's a phenomenal game. If you have any love or nostalgia for the old Super Nintendo RPGs, highly recommended. It won awards last year. We were good with this one, right? Solid game and Canadian made. Yes, I did not. I forgot to mention that. Yeah, Sea of Stars was made in Quebec, I believe. I know it's Canadian made. I believe it was Quebec. So now that we've got that out of the way, we can get to the fun stuff. So let's get into the list proper. And we're going to start with Who Remembers. Remember, we always do the Who Remembers section, and then we do the There's an Indie for that section. I haven't changed that. Why fix what isn't broken, So, who remembers Castlevania 3, Dracula's Curse? Who doesn't love themselves some old school classic jump and whip vampire slaying action? I've mentioned this series in the past a few times in previous years, but I don't think we've ever gone as far back in this series as like the NES games and the 8-bit era to dig up a title from this franchise to talk about. The second sequel to the original NES title that started it all, Castlevania 3, Dracula's Quest. I almost said Dracula's Quest. That's not what it is. It's Dracula's Curse. That would have been a slip-up. Was a pivot back to the standard level-by-level structure that the previous game in the series, Simon's Quest, which was what I was nearly slipping into, that game deviated a little bit away from the whole level-by-level thing by trying to be open world. So with this third game, they kind of went back to, okay, Stage 1, Stage 2, Stage 3, and that's what we're back to, and we're back to jumping and whipping and everything. But it comes with a few new features. And most notably in Castlevania 3 was the addition of 3 additional playable characters for the player to search and rescue throughout their journey. Once found, they could be recruited one at a time to serve as the alternate hero for the player to swap from on the fly, offering new weapons, new spells, new abilities. This, coupled with a few instances of branching paths in the level progression, meant that each playthrough of the game could potentially be very different from the previous, which was something that we didn't see a whole lot of when we were just playing on NES games back in the day, so it was kind of a new thing. This also gave the level designers a chance to hide secrets and shortcuts around the levels that only certain members of the supporting characters could reach, meaning that players who wanted to explore every castle and dungeon and mansion and swamp and forest throughout the entire game would have to seek out different routes and recruit different partners as they journeyed forward. It wasn't quite the ambitious reach of Simon's Quest, but what was at the time. But this new non-linear structure of the game was exactly enough to spice up the old standard level-by-level progression of the original Castlevania, which made it feel less repetitive, and it gave players more chances to discover new things each time they began a new quest into the game's haunted story. And there's an indie for that. You were all waiting for that, weren't you? This is Bloodstained, Curse of the Moon. This is an offshoot prequel story to Koji Igarashi's Kickstarter successful game Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. Igarashi, by the way, being the game developer that helmed a lot of the old school classic Castlevania games back in the day. Curse of the Moon and its sequel, there's actually 2 of them, both play out like old school 8-bit Castlevania games in everything but the name and labels. Vampirism is replaced with alchemy, but other than that, you all know the drill. There's evil out there in the night somewhere, and it's up to you to go out and smite it. You'll have the team that you need to get the job done, too, as you have a crew of swordsmen, they're not wizards, they're alchemists, and other powerful heroes that'll all be at your disposal. And taking cues from the classic games that we were just talking about, you'll be able to quickly swap between any living hero that you have with you on the fly, allowing you to combine the strengths and abilities of your whole team to fight your way through the monstrous armies, then weave your way through all the labyrinthian levels. In addition to the gameplay harkening back to the good old days of 2D platforming jump and slash, and whip and spellcasting action, the graphics are rocking quite the retro look as well, with beautifully designed 8-bit sprites and environments and large-scale, detailed boss battles. The creature design in some of these end-level challenges really invoke the sense of appreciation for how refined sprite work, artistry has become ever since like 10 years ago when every other indie game decided, hey, let's just do sprites. Add in a few modern gameplay touches that this game also has, like accessibility options, difficulty sliders, and even simultaneous 2-player co-op. And Curse of the Moon realizes the kind of potential game developers like Igarashi could only imagine decades ago. I backed this one. Couldn't play it because I don't have the system for it, but I backed it. Yeah, it was very Kickstarter successful. It was part of like one of those. It was like Bloodstained Ritual of the Night was a very successful Kickstarter story. What system is this on? I believe it's on everything. Like, to preface this, most of the games I'm going to be talking about, I can guarantee you are on Steam, because that's where I play them on. Majority of them are probably, I'm pretty sure this one's on the Switch as well. Does anybody in the audience play on anything besides Steam or the Switch? Just curious. Yep, 2-player co-op, simultaneous 2-player co-op. It's not hot seat either. It's you both play at the same time, which anybody who's played a modern Mario game can tell you can be a lot of chaotic fun if you try to keep out of each other's way. Now, who remembers Mega Man Zero? The leap in generations within the venerated Mega Man franchise saw a transition from the classic 8-bit games in the 80s to the Mega Man X series in the 90s, which then brought us to the Zero series on the Game Boy Advance in the 2000s. This saw the passing of the torch from the series' main characters Mega Man and Mega Man X, with their tried and true gameplay mechanics of running, jumping, shooting through dozens of stages, to a more melee and close combat focused character of Zero, who had been steadily gaining popularity throughout the Mega Man X series. Now at the forefront of his own branch of the franchise, Zero became the central focus of this new legacy of side-scrolling platforming action games on the Nintendo handheld consoles, and he picked up right where he had left off in the previous series. He was running, jumping, dashing, slashing, battling his way through armies of robots and baddies just as well as the Blue Bomber ever had. As a torchbearer, Zero fulfilled his duties and kept the franchise marching along, but as a standalone franchise, the Mega Man Zero games were popular enough on their own to spawn at least a half dozen sequels that kept people swinging the Z-Saber away well into the years that followed. And there's an indie for that. This is Gravity Circuit. Wearing its influences loud and proud right on its sleeves and in its trailers and its screenshots, Gravity Circuit checks off every box needed to be considered a faithful tribute to the Mega Man and Zero series. It has tight controls, wonderfully designed sprite animations, and a soundtrack that will have every high-energy, chiptune-loving nerve in your body just dancing with excited spasms. The developers of this game went out of their way to make sure that every screen, every sound, every sprite, background detail, everything just screamed Mega Man X and Mega Man Zero. You've got another roster of 8 big bad bosses that you have to take down in any order that you choose, all of whom sit at the end of 8 brand new, yet seemingly familiar 2D platforming action levels that all hit the nostalgic notes. There's spikes, there's pits, there's fire traps, there's icy floors, conveyor belts, you name it. And the bosses, they might as well just be dancing around their arenas with gigantic signs over their head that says, "Do you remember Airman, Drillman, Dustman, Frogman?" Actually, believe it or not, Frogman was an actual Mega Man boss. Toadman, I think is what his name was. Taking them on is our main character here, Kai, decked out in the titular Gravity Circuit, which is a modifiable suit of kick-ass robot armor that lets him kick, punch, dash, jump, tackle, ground pound, and even grappling hook his way across levels so easily and satisfyingly. It's like playing Mega Man, Ninja Gaiden, and Street Fighter all at once. It's awesome. This is a slick, fast-paced, hard-hitting tribute to the 2D jump and shoot and slash robo action games of the last 30 years or so that absolutely deserves a place in the library of anyone that has ever loved powering up the Mega Buster or swinging the Z-Saber. 7 Deadly Streamers, I love that you have the Dr. Wily emote. That is amazing. Is there a sewer level? Could be. There just might be. We'll see how often that motif comes up again. It looks very pretty too, and it sounds amazing. I don't have any of the sound play, but you look at some of the trailers or watch some gameplay footage of it and just listen to it, the background music. Oh, mwah. Anyway, we must move on. Who remembers Myst? Ooh, bit of a left turn there, wasn't it? It's easy to forget, but for a brief period in time in the early 90s, if you were lucky enough to have a personal computer and luckier still to be able to play games on it, the game that you were likely playing was Doom. Let's be honest. It wasn't that thing installed on more computers than the Windows operating system. But unless you didn't care about all that violence and shooting and gunplay and monsters and everything, then you were probably playing Myst. Yeah. This was the game that sold developers on CD-ROM technology, right? Like there was 3D environments, there was live action motion and voices and actors on screen showing up. There was sprawling exploratory gameplay. That wasn't really a thing in the video game landscape until Myst came along and showed everyone that you could engage with players without the need for points or power-ups or princesses. It allowed for narrative and puzzle gameplay to take center stage as players stepped into different ages and were given free rein to just wander around and mess around with whatever strange arcane devices that they came across until inevitably they stumbled into some secret passage or unlocked a hidden door somewhere without even trying to. Myst was a pioneer in non-conflict focused gaming that paved the way for countless other narrative-driven first-person gaming experiences that followed decades after its initial release. It gave players a strange world to get lost in and all the time in the world to figure out what secrets laid within them and how to figure them all out. And there's an indie for that. This is Firmament. Yes, I am absolutely cheating with this one because Firmament was from developer Cyan, who also made Myst and its sequels. And it's basically their second swing at a large-scale puzzle world exploration game nearly 3 decades after it first arrived on the scene with the classic CD-ROM adventure. So it shouldn't surprise anyone at all that with the benefit of 30 years of game technology and graphics technology and gaming development, Cyan has created another gloriously beautiful world full of enigmatic steampunk architecture and almost alien landscapes for players to explore and discover the secrets of. The look of everything in this game is polished and crafted with detail, and the new gameplay mechanic of interacting with the world via the futuristic handheld device known as the Agent, I believe it's called, gives the sense that the developers saw how successfully gaming tools like the Portal Gun or the Gravity Gun were and decided to do their own spin on it, you know? While the presentation and tools used to play the game have certainly been given upgrades, Cyan hasn't forgotten their roots at all in Firmament because it's packed with tricky logic and lateral puzzles that need to be solved to grant access further into the game. Using the Adjunct, players are going to be turning switches, moving platforms, unlocking all kinds of secrets, and opening up the story of what's going on in this mysterious world. Sometimes the idea for an indie based on a venerated franchise doesn't always have to come from outside the minds of the team that came up with the original idea. I mean, look back at that Castlevania thing that we were just talking about 2 or 3 entries ago. Firmament is a great example of how game developers can refine their vision and present fresh offerings in the process. Manpants is going crazy right now because, yes, the first time that she had to play this game, she had to play it on my rig because her gaming PC wasn't powerful enough. So, she loved it, although you wouldn't know that from how she was reacting to it. And I'll be honest, I kind of want to check this game out too, but as with most of us, who has the time, right? I'm picking up that the theme of this year's entire Con-G is who has the time? Nick, do we have any extra time left over from your time travel panel that you could give us so that we could play all these amazing games? Come on, man. Help us out here. Okay, moving into something, and this is where the viewer discretion as advised warning would pop up if I bothered to actually make a graphic for it. But who remembers Blood? In the wake of PC gaming exploding with popularity in the 90s after Doom became more popular than the Windows operating system, countless other first-person monster shooting games popped up, all looking to cash in on its success. One of which was Monolith's Blood, which swapped out the heavy metal cover aesthetics of Doom for a gunslinging Halloween horror theme made on the Build engine, previously known for being home of other big late 90s first-person properties like Shadow Warrior and, of course, Duke Nukem. But Blood puts you in the shoes of Caleb, a 19th century gunslinger out for revenge against the dark god Chernobog. Along the way, he'll shoot, burn, and blast his way through zombies, cultists, and other monstrous underlings using some of the most unique weapons featured in a first-person shooter at the time. Sure, there's a shotgun, yeah, there's a Tommy gun, and there's even kind of sort of a rocket launcher too, but early in the game, instead of like a little pea shooter pistol or whatever, Caleb gets things like flare guns and bundles of TNT, which he uses to unceremoniously blow the hell out of enemies while cackling like a maniac every single time he comes across them. This made playing as Caleb through a game like this much more of a force of chaos trip, as the rest of the crazy enemies running around were just as loony as the main character was, and it gave the whole experience of playing Blood a fun sense of spooky lunacy, like you were charging through the most amped up Halloween spook house ever with tons of ammunition, you know? The power fantasy that Doom Guy first established when he was bursting onto the scene was kept alive and given a lot of fun personality in the Build engine with anti-heroes like Caleb in games like Blood. Looks like Heretic. You know what? That's not a bad comparison either. Heretic was a little bit more like fantasy Dungeons and Dragons theme. This is more Army of Darkness, I think, is what we're aiming for with this kind of stuff. And believe it or not, there's an indie for that. A lot of the indies that I talk about year after year on these lists can easily be the spiritual successor to their gaming ancestors. Granted, like we mentioned Myst, we mentioned the Castlevania thing, but this is cultic, and it stands as a perfect example of that behavior. I told you that was going to become a repeating thing. Those of you out there who were nodding along with me just now when I was describing Blood, sing along if you know the words to this one. Cultic sees you as a gunslinging detective gone rogue in the 1960s in the middle of nowhere amidst a cult community of maniacs, mutants, undead, and even demonic bad guys, and you have to shoot, burn, and blast your way through them with pistols, shotguns, rifles, flamethrowers, and lots and lots and lots of TNT. The levels are pretty open-ended with some light key hunting here and there, and occasionally some grand set pieces like a zombie holdout or a skirmish with a tank might pop up, but for the most part, it's you versus the entire army in front of you, and you have all the ammunition you'll ever want, so get the job done. Like boomer shooters of the 90s before it, Cultic is only concerned with putting you right in the middle of the action and making all the run-and-gun carnage as streamlined and engaging as possible. It doesn't skimp on level design and the art direction either, which is cool and everything. It's got cool settings like vast open forests, abandoned churches and cathedrals, spooky haunted asylums and temples and so on. But where it shines is right where it needs to, in the moment-to-moment first-person shooting. Boomer shooters have enjoyed a huge resurgence in the last decade or so, and Cultic stands proud as one of the most visceral and satisfying entries in the retro-inspired genre of gaming. It's got a great, solid single-player campaign already out that's been out since last year, and the second half of that is coming out later on this year, which will complete the story, and it is a fantastic, no-nonsense first-person shooter adventure that, if you're into this kind of stuff, you definitely don't want to sleep on. Kind of a mix of PS1 era and 90s PC. Yeah. A lot of, like, it's 3D, but it's retro 3D. A lot of what are called voxels in this game. Voxels you can think of as like 3D sprites. Sprites are like 2D and blocky. Voxels are 3D and blocky. It doesn't use a lot of 3D models. It uses voxels instead. And it looks really good. It has a consistent art design. It might look a little muddy in the color scheme or whatever, and maybe that's not your thing, but it is consistent throughout. And it plays buttery smooth, let me tell you. Next up, who remembers Jet Set Radio? Wonder if my neighbors heard that. From the golden age of the Sega Dreamcast comes this crazy roller skating title that looked and sounded unlike anything else at the time. Jet Set Radio had the energy of similar manic score-hunting arcade games like Crazy Taxi, but it came with a fresh new identity that combined outrageous costumes and art design, funky, fast-paced music, and tricky open-world traversal puzzles into a wild, loud party of a roller skating game. Zeke's already singing the song because apparently they recognize it. Instead of the more technical aspects of skating games, like stuff like Tony Hawk would ask you to do, Jet Set Radio's approach was to make the impressive task of grinding across railings and leaping through the air from billboards and rooftops as easy and accessible as possible so that anyone could step into the oversized skates of any of the dozen of the colorful characters and get right into pulling off insane stunts and gnarly moves. Once they were moving, players could spend hours skating around the equally colorful and bizarre levels looking for secrets, objectives, and of course all of the sweet graffiti spots to splash some cool tags all over. Pulling off tricks and combos earned high scores and bragging rights, and all the while the stylized cel-shaded graphics and signature score of funky tracks and hip-hop beats gave the whole game a life and identity of its own. It may never have reached the lofty heights of the more popular franchises, but for those who were stumbling across it during its peak years, Jet Set Radio stood out as a unique and enduring gaming experience that was really hard to forget. Looks fun. It is fun. A lot of people agreed. They made a sequel for it on the Xbox, actually. And then it went quiet for a while, but then there was an indie for that. I feel like the footage pretty much does most of the talking for me on this one. I mean, let's be honest, those of you out there who aren't familiar with Jet Set Radio probably thought I forgot to hit a button just here, and you're looking at the exact same footage from the same game right now, aren't you? This is Bomb Rush Cyberfunk, and it sets out with exactly one mission statement. Just make Jet Set Radio again, but just don't call it Jet Set Radio. It's got the same cel-shaded art style, that's carried on. The same kinetic dash, jump, grind, trick movement loop, that's carried on. Although this time you have your choice of not just donning rocket-powered roller skates, but also jet-boosted skateboards and revved-up trick bicycles as well. The same funky tunes and hip-hop beats have carried on as well, and they even brought back the lead composer from Jet Set Radio to work on the soundtrack for this game, so it almost sounds like nothing's changed. If all of that was what stuck out in your mind about the Jet Set Radio games, you'll find all of it preserved and polished up with a fresh coat of graffiti waiting for you as soon as you boot this game up. Even the parts of the original that weren't as strongly remembered seem to have been transplanted directly from Jet Set Radio to Bomb Rush Cyberfunk. I mean, you still have to deal with pesky police officers and law enforcement machines and drones and whatnot. They are always rushing in to try and spoil your fun, just like the no-fun authoritarian bad guys that they are. I was trying to use more colorful language there, but I stopped myself. And those of you also who are a bit of completionists and tend to aim for like collecting all the things or whatever, you're going to find that the uphill battle to find every hidden collectible and tagging location from Jet Set Radio has only gotten more steep in this new outing. So be ready for that if you are looking to get those 100% trophies, because it's going to take you a while. Suffice to say, for those of you that have been missing this specific franchise all these years, your time has come. It's been tagged by a new crew, but this is the Jet Set Radio spiritual successor that you've all been waiting for. It has skateboards. It also has bicycles in it, too, like trick bikes. Isn't there also a Jet Set Radio sequel coming out? Yeah, I found out about that after I had written my script. Besides, I think this is probably hits a little harder. Plus, this is out now, and I have gameplay footage that I can share of it, so there. Z, I still love the fact that you had the soundtrack song queued up in your head immediately. Admittedly, it's hard to forget some of the iconic music from Jet Set Radio, because it was iconic for a reason. It's like we get to see you play the game before, indeed. Now, going back quite a few years for this next one, who remembers Star Fox? Yes, this is Star Fox, the original Star Fox on the Super Nintendo. It probably looks like some grade school computer graphics designer's homework, but trust us, back in the Bronze Age of gaming, this was, well, it's what we had. Even though we thought it was, even back then, we thought this looked a little primitive when it was on a system that stuff like F-Zero and Super Metroid were also available on, so. But as humble beginnings go, it was quite the place for Fox McCloud and his team to start out, piloting a group of what looks like maybe a half dozen polygons down a narrow path for 5 or 6 levels that ran at what looks like maybe 10 frames per second. Still, leave it to Nintendo in the 90s to take something that looked as rough as this did and still turn it into something by dressing it up with fun furry mascots, so they had something to put on the box and the Nintendo Power Up covers, you know. The game itself only barely contained those characters, though. So once we all got it home and all we had in front of us was the core polygon rail shooter that made up a dozen or so levels, that's what we had. Luckily, that core gameplay loop had a little bit more refinement to it than perhaps some of the graphics did, looking like they did, like some even older PC flight simulator had made its way into the house of Link and Mario. But blasting away robots and other ships that looked like they were made out of even less polygons did hold a certain appeal once we got a handle on how the sluggish air wing flew. And the satisfying explosion at the end of every like boss fight or whatever, that was a satisfying punctuation mark at the end of each stage, to be sure, like Mega Man X was doing. So there was that. It may not have looked, the game certainly didn't have what we were expecting when you think of an old Star Fox game. It didn't have lock-on targeting. It didn't have do a barrel roll. It was a version 1.0 prototype of what would eventually, though, become another of Nintendo's roster of first-party properties. I will be able to talk at some point. But Star Fox offered a chance to fly around worlds and shoot lasers at stuff, which usually was pretty good enough for us when we were just little kids playing Super Nintendo games, you know? I totally didn't intentionally shoot at Peppy because he kept getting in my way. No, neither did any of us. That was on him, man. He should have cleared the line of fire, man. He's an old veteran soldier. He should know better. You talk good. Don't worry. Me good. Thanks. Thanks, Z. Good talking with the words things. Anyway, Star Fox, old school, but there's an indie for it. So, what if you took all of what we were just talking about and made it not run at 10 frames per second, and you added in more than 30 or so polygons on the screen at once? What if you took some of the gameplay mechanics from the later games in the franchise and retrofitted them to work the same way, but back on the old prototype game? What if you were to remake the Super Nintendo version of Star Fox 30 years later, but wanted everyone to still say, yep, that's Star Fox? Well, you'd probably have something like X Zodiac. Borrowing blueprints from the original Star Fox as well as its Sega counterpart Space Harrier, for those of you who are more Team Sonic, this small indie takes the low-poly rail-flying shooters from decades ago and puts some modern gameplay horsepower behind them, creating an exciting, colorful arcade experience of flying, dodging, aiming, and shooting lots of lasers and missiles and at dozens and dozens of very explosive enemies and ships. There isn't much that you'll need to learn if you spent any amount of time cruising through games like Star Fox 64, which was the more popular sequel that came out years later on the Nintendo 64. I mean, this game has boosting, it has braking, it has loop-de-loops, it has barrel rolls. They're all still there, as well as all of the floating fluid motion of the run-and-gun sections. It just looks a little bit more impressive and plays far more smoothly than it ever did on a 16-bit system. If all you were looking for was to revisit the same kind of signature gameplay without the host of animal mascot wingmen constantly chattering in your ear, X Zodiac will definitely scratch that particular itch. Just be warned, you're trading up the animal mascots this time around for anime girls, but I don't think anybody's going to have too much of a problem with that. 32 polygons! It's amazing what you can do with just 32 polygons. It is pretty, isn't it pretty? It's very colorful. I like it. I had to feature it. And again, I saw gameplay trailers from this. I'm thinking it's just Star Fox, but what Star Fox was supposed to look like. Moving right along to something maybe a little less pretty. How many of you out there remember Resident Evil? I hope that nobody notices that I am going back to this particular well again after last year. But here we are. It is the definitive OG survival horror experience that took shooting zombies from the arcade experience and horde blasting power fantasy to a place that was truly unnerving. You know, ammo was limited, layouts were confusing, the voice acting was legendarily bad, but none of that stopped this franchise from becoming the quintessential survival horror experience. There were many gears in this particular machine that made Resident Evil what it was, but chief among them, at least in the early days of fixed camera angles and Jill sandwiches, was the labyrinthian puzzle boxes that were the Spencer Mansion, the RPD headquarters, and all of the other umbrella facilities and labs that for some reason were always underneath everywhere that you were in any of these games. And you had to unlock those puzzle boxes by like hunting for keys and avoiding encounters. Sometimes when you found an important tool, usually a crank, or a clue that allowed you to access a new area, the game would spring out some new surprises on you by like crashing a helicopter into a hallway or dropping a new type of dangerous monster into the mix that you had to figure out how to deal with. As they shifted and evolved throughout your playthrough, the settings for these games became characters in and of themselves. Hours were spent racing back and forth through hallways and corridors and the streets of Raccoon City, let's not forget that. And you were never sure if the game was going to throw something new or horrible at you after every single turn. He said clue. I did say clue. Those of you who are looking, keep looking. Manpan says, oh, I know where this is going. Do you, Manpans? You might. Gears and cranks and cogs and crests. Crests were another thing that the Resident Evil games seemed to have a fondness for because there were always crests. Like, keys could never just be keys in Resident Evil, even though it had its fair share of keys in it. But anyway, there's an indie for that. What if you were to take the terrifying claustrophobia and sense of being lost and starved for resources amid constant threats and danger, and you took it out of the zombie apocalypse? We were on about this during the horror panel last night, where everything was zombies. What if instead, all of that tense, gritty dread was set somewhere a little bit more relatable than a B-grade horror movie? Well, this is Conscript, and it is set during one of the longest, darkest, and most blood-soaked battles in human history. In this game, you step into the shoes of a young French soldier during the infamous 1916 Battle of Verdun, the longest ongoing conflict of the First World War. You're on a mission to find your missing brother. There are trenches to navigate that are filled with locked doors, hidden traps, and dangerous enemy soldiers. You have a limited inventory that you have to manage from storage boxes. You have rickety, era-appropriate firearms that may or may not always be reliable enough to save you from the dangers that you'll encounter. Hell, there's even a few friendly, opportunistic soldiers that'll trade you additional supplies if you happen to have enough cigarettes to barter with them. It's a different flavor of survival horror video gaming that does an effective job of recreating that every tense moment and decision that you can remember making while trying to escape from Raccoon City. But it's the horrors of war, especially this specific event in one of the biggest wars in recent history. And it easily stands toe-to-toe with any Hollywood Living Dead story, and I think it's something that I can't wait to play. It's not even out yet. I've played the demo of it, and I couldn't stop saying this is so Resident Evil the whole time I was playing through it. Conscript takes advantage of the fact that it is better than Hollywood Living Dead movies by a wide margin, and more creative and innovative and fresh, and it turns it into an engaging and dive into a horrific, brutal, and dark gaming experience. The real enemy was man. It's always man. Disney movies used to teach us that back when we were kids. Man was always the problem. Another twist. Something a little less dark, though. We're going back quite a stretch on this one to a game that probably nobody but me has played. How many of you guys remember Power Blade on the NES. What? Yeah, I'm right there with you. Not every game on the NES could become as big as Castlevania or Mega Man, but it sure wasn't for a lack of trying. Power Blade likely doesn't stand out ahead of any of the bigger, older titles that gamers like us think of when we reminisce about the glorious 8-bit days of platform action games, but put it shoulder to shoulder with any other stage-by-stage, left-to-right jump-and-shoot title from the era, and you'd be surprised how many similarities pop out immediately. I don't remember ever seeing this one. No, that's what I was going for, yeah. Power Blade puts you into the role of Nova, a stock 1980s flat-top, muscle-bound beefcake tasked with saving a futuristic city from the evil, destructive force of the notorious Delta Corporation. Doesn't that sound like an NES game from the 80s? To do this, you'll have to battle your way through a half dozen stages using your trusty boomerang. Look, they made it all metal and sci-fi, kind of like the one from the one Road Warrior movie, okay? It's fine. Don't worry about it. Plus, that was just your starting weapon anyway. Later on in the game, throughout the levels, you also pick up a cyber armor suit that just basically turns you into Mega Man, so it's fine. With all that in place, the game follows in the footsteps of all the NES greats, offering you, again, level-by-level combat and platforming challenges before settling in on a nice, cozy boss fight in a big box room. Textbook stuff that was the backbone of games like this, and Power Blade was just no exception. It was the quintessential action game experience on the NES that looked, sounded, and played exactly like we all remember most games looking, sounding, and playing on that wonderful little gray box with the red light on the front of it. So it should be no surprise to anyone that there is so many indies for this. I had trouble actually narrowing it down which indie I was going to pick to put as the analog of this one, but one stood out as a pretty clear example. This is Prison City. It's getting scary how many of these entries boil down to just make it again, but change the name. But here's another one where they just made it again and changed the name. This is more of that high-quality pixel art refinement we've seen in previous entries on this list, where the design Bible seems to have started and finished with make an NES game on current hardware. Prison City also puts you in the role of a stock 1980s flat-top muscle-bound beefcake, only this time we're doing the Escape from LA thing and sending him into an entire city of dangerous, heavily armed criminals. Oh, and we've ditched the Mega Man armor this time and everything and just made him half cyborg just to save time. But he still kicks ass with a boomerang-like projectile that you'll be throwing and catching over and over as you fight through all the levels. In keeping with being a big bear hug to Gen X and millennial gamers, you can expect a healthy dose of all the usual reference humor that always crops up in games like this as well. Somewhere between fending off knockoff Ed 209s and outrunning the hockey mask-wearing Mad Max villains, you'll come to realize that the developers of this game weren't interested in just making a game that borrows enemy design from Mega Man or stage layouts from Ninja Gaiden or boss fights from Contra or Castlevania. No, they just wanted to make 1988 the video game. And they succeeded. Snag this one for the old school nostalgic 80s baby in your life, and you'll probably get a lot of praise and thanks in return. Prison City joins the ranks of games like Shovel Knight and Cyber Shadow as the greatest NES game that we never got to play on the NES. Electric seaweed! I told you there was references in there. There's even references to old video games because everybody making video games nowadays is our age, and we all remember how much we hated that seaweed in the Ninja Turtles video game. How many of you remember, this one might be a bit of a left turn as well, Sim City? This one might be my odd duck this year. I have one every year. An entry from an old game that nobody would expect me to feature or some niche genre of games that not a lot of people play anymore. SimCity was the original city building simulator that found its niche audience as a PC game and then an even more niche audience when the Super Nintendo port popped up a few years later, which is what you're seeing on the screen right now. That's from the Super Nintendo version. I featured that one just because that's the one I played the most of. When it was first conceived, this little city planning game resembled what actual city planning was about as much as Punch-Out resembled actual boxing. So instead, what both games ended up being was more like live-action puzzles that the player had to spend hours trying to slowly solve moment to moment and decision by decision. There were small objectives constantly popping up that needed careful planning in order to mitigate. And only a patient and focused mayor could balance all of these issues over a long enough period of time in order to see that their little city was flourishing. When it did flourish, though, it was quite the sight to behold. I mean, when you pan the camera across what was once a small little community with a power plant and a few houses or whatever, and over the course of a weekend, that turns into a sprawling metropolis, it gives the players a sense of accomplishment as we decide to ignore the fact that a video game has somehow made us do hours of planning and work. Well, there's lots of indies for this one, too. But I got a weird one for this one. This is SteamWorld Build. The makers of the SteamWorld series of video games have made it a point to never stay in one lane when it comes to the genre of games they've made. They've made Metroidvanias, they've made deck-building RPGs, they've made tactical cover shooters, and now they've made a city builder. One where you construct a small mining town from scratch and use it to dig for ancient alien artifacts. The city building sections of SteamWorld Build follow closely in step with how early city builders like SimCity involved providing citizens with proper resources and living facilities that they need to live their best Steambot lives. Laying down residential areas and living facilities, and I lost myself in my script, laying down residential areas for bots to live in and industry and factories for them to work in helps your city grow, but also provides you the resources that you might need to meet your mining objectives, because there's a mining game attached to this as well. I'm focusing more on the city building part of this because that's the part that interests me a little bit more, at least when I saw the trailers of this. But as always, all your citizens' requests are not so easily fulfilled because people are complicated and Steambots are too. And there's quite a lot of resources besides just your budget that you'll need to manage if you're going to make sure that your progress in building your city doesn't bottleneck anywhere and stall out. But once you've got a strong enough workforce and you've got your mining operation underway, you'll have access to build better residents that will attract the higher tier Steambots. So you could get higher classes of different Steambots living in your city, so it's not just all backwater miners and everything. Not that they don't have a place and everything and whatnot, but you can get like hoity-toity Steambots living in there who want to go out and eat at all the restaurants and eventually also invite in like scientists and whatnot to join you as well. And, you're going to need you might, turn your nose up at the hoity-toity bots and everything, but they bring in the money and the resources and the industry and, again, the science and the knowledge and everything that's going to take to inevitably reach the goal of this game, because inevitably you build your city up to a size where you eventually do the civilization thing where you have to build a rocket ship so you can take your entire civilization out into space. SteamWorld Build takes all of your hard work and careful city planning and gives you the chance to blast off and take it out to beyond the stars. Neat! It is neat, yes. I love those thick, wobbly buildings. Yeah, the game has a very playful design aesthetic to it, and it's very charming is one way that I can put it. It doesn't have like the coldness of newer city builder games like Skylines, for example, has. And I'm not saying that that I have a problem with Skylines or whatever, because those games, if you're looking to just get entrenched in all of the details and nitty-gritty systems interlocking with each other or whatever, this is a little bit more of like baby's first city builder, so it may not scratch that itch, but it has a lot of charm to it, and I'm hoping that it finds an audience somewhere. Last but not least, let's close things out with one more, and I think we'll go to one that I think everybody remembers for the nostalgic pop on this one. Who remembers Portal? Everybody remembers Portal. It's the little game that could. Well, it started out as what everybody presumed was going to be just a little game, but obviously that's not where it stayed once we all got our hands on it. 3D puzzle games may have existed before Aperture Science was ever a thing, but once this game landed, it became the gold standard for games about solving problems with boxes, buttons, and holes in the wall. The developers of Portal made the exact right call every step of the way during its development. They started with a rock-solid gameplay mechanic that unlocked a limitless supply of design ideas for lateral puzzles for players to solve. Then they polished that mechanic up with some slick technology that made the reality-bending portals read more realistically than we ever thought they could. One glimpse of our silent protagonist through the very first portal at the very start of the game was all it took to just impress everybody and get everyone hooked. And then once finally all those challenges had been built and everything, what'd they do? They surrounded the entire gaming experience in a richly detailed world populated with memorable characters that went on to become iconic mainstays in the pantheon of popular video game mascots. Everybody knows who GLaDOS is. Everybody knows who Wheatley is. All of that mixed together and topped with probably one of the most iconic credit songs ever put in a video game made Portal an unforgettable little puzzle game that everybody loved. And everybody is now quoting the lyrics to that song in the chat. Well, there's an indie for this one too. This is the Entropy Center. Naturally, when something fresh and new becomes the coolest thing that everyone loves, there's going to be some folks that take inspiration from it, we'll say, and try to give it their own spin. The Entropy Center replaces the physic warping powers of the portal gun with a more traditional video game mechanic that those of you who were around for a couple of panels ago are already very familiar with: time rewinding. Our story begins in this game once again with a lone test subject waking up in an abandoned science facility with only a strange science gun that can manipulate the temporal status of objects around it, and a host of quirky robots and pre-recorded messages as well to keep them company. It's up to our hero to figure out what happened in this facility and what it has to do with the seemingly apocalyptic events happening just beyond its walls by, you guessed it, solving our way through room after room of boxes, switches, and doors that only open when boxes are on switches. Much like how the player had to wrap their heads around the use of the game's central mechanic to solve puzzles in Portal, a mastery of manipulating tools and puzzle pieces fourth dimensionally will be needed if players want to unlock the secrets of the Entropy Center. In that sense, the game does a great job of giving players a lot to chew on mentally each time they enter a new room, and the aha moments that come as a result of those ideas coming to fruition are just as palpable as they ever were when Shell was helping us figure them out. As a game that's wearing its inspiration loud and proud on its sleeve, the Entropy Center might just be a return to the clever 3D puzzle solving, lateral puzzle solving thrills that we all remember from years ago. And that's my list. How many of those games did you guys remember? How many of those games are you guys going to put on your wish lists and never have time to play? Let me know in the chat. Let me know in the Discord. I am interested to figure that out. I think we got through all of that in good time. I think we will wrap up here real quickly. Again, thanks very much to Kanji for giving me the opportunity to hang out with all of you guys and gush about some cool games. I hope everybody enjoyed and maybe has one or two new games on your wish lists. Hit me up over on Kanji's Discord. I'm going to be over there all weekend, as you guys know, lurking around and doing what I can to make Kanji just the bestest it can possibly be. But I will be keeping a keen eye on the video game thread over on the Discord. So if you happen to pop in there and you have ideas of other stuff that I can put on maybe next year's list, hit me up in there, throw me some trailers or some screenshots or whatever, or just get a discussion going there. I will see you guys over there, and we'll just talk about video games, because that's what you do at a convention, even a virtual convention. But that's it for me, though. Everybody enjoy the rest of your convention weekend. Do stay tuned, because I believe Sammy's coming up next with some more nostalgia and member berries to share with you guys, so you won't want to miss that. My name's been Dan the Video Ninja. Thanks, everybody, for joining me, and enjoy the rest of Kanji, everybody.